This is the Outskirts Podcast with Tanner and friends. I'm Tanner, and you, friends, are owed a spooky story. It's Halloween, after all. Without further ado, here's a spooky story from me to you. And if you can believe it, it's mostly true. I was 9 years old in the weeks leading up to the Halloween of 1988. And let me tell you, it was a good time to be a boy of 9. If, like me, you're a middle-aged fan of the show Stranger Things, it's probably for that reason. It's probably because, like me, you like to remember. I like the nostalgia I feel when I'm triggered to remember the wild mix of freedom and horror that was my childhood. As I explored the world around my neighborhood on bike and on foot, tromping through mostly unfenced backyards to destinations unknown, blazing trails, widening my reach, unsupervised with only the streetlights to urge me home in time for dinner. And wasn't it the stories of those gone before that often set my course? An older sister who told scary tales that were true or she hoped to die, of a secret ritual site in the woods behind the 7-Eleven. Or those cool and mean as hell teenagers, the ones who pointed a BB gun at my face when my fledgling skateboarder friends and I naively trespassed into that backyard with the half pipe in it. It's okay. Bobby's mom said Mrs. Nash said we could. Her son doesn't even use it anymore. He's off to college. It's all ours, guys! We were silly kids in the best sense of the word. On our way to a new-to-us neighborhood conquest, the future Tony Hawk, Lance Mountain, and Mike McGill in our minds. Skateboarding legends in the making. Arriving, skateboards in hand, our dreams suddenly and blatantly didn't matter. No, kid, beat it! This is our spot! Hey, why don't you little guys go ride your bikes on the trails behind Beverly Farms Elementary?
The ones where the jumps have huge pits filled with branches carved into spikes on the sides.
The ones where high schoolers kill you if you enter.
Yeah, those trails, where that kid Bobby went missing.
Got killed by a BMX psychopath. Yeah. Now seriously, beat it, twerps.
Come on, guys. Bobby, did you really go missing?
When you're 9 years old, a kid of 16 can seem like all the monster you can ever possibly deal with. But that Halloween, we learned that even the scariest 16-year-old is just as vulnerable, every bit as much just a kid as we were. I mentioned Stranger Things earlier. Well, from ages 3 to 9, I lived across the street from Eddie Munson. Only there were 3 of them. Catty corner from my house, on the aptly named Devilwood Drive, was the Fay house. It was a red brick, 2-story house with fake shutters just like mine. But the similarity did not extend beyond the exterior veneers. Inside, it was a different world altogether. A world that seemed to have been constructed chiefly by the 3 brothers who lived there. A house with R-rated movies and metal records playing backwards around the clock. A house with a basement table covered in Dungeons and Dragons and Ouija boards and candles. Their ages ranged from 12 to 18. The youngest being a rare older playmate of mine named Brian, and his 2 older brothers, Kevin and Owen. Owen was a metalhead, and Kevin was a punk, but they were both the embodiment of horror to me. Kevin was around more often. Being the middle child and forced to share a car with his older brother, he spent more time in their shared attic bedroom than out on the town. It was in that room where I first heard of the lead singer of AC/DC's choking to death on his own vomit. To be sure, it was there that I first heard of AC/DC at all. In that room. There was actual talk of the devil. I actually heard records played in reverse, but was only confused. not convinced of anything. This was what I understood about Kevin. To him, the darkness was a thing to be played with. It was a fashion, a source of entertainment, a rebellion against his parents and the upper-class society he was born into. It was all the things it has been to so many teens for so long. But to Kevin, it was also maybe just a little bit more. At least, that's the sense I'm left with as I pore over my memories of him. As for the Faye parents, they were only ever occasionally around. I remember their mother's thick Scottish accent, but not much else. They never really factored into my experiences of the Fays. That is, not until Kevin went missing. As I recall, it began one evening in mid-October, 1988. Brian and I sat on his hillside lawn, watching our other friends begin their relatively long bike rides home. As the sounds of play dwindled, and as dusk settled upon our block, I remember noticing the 2 or 3 remaining fireflies, flashing out their lost causes, with Brian's last words to Sandros still hanging in the air. "Watch out for the rabid raccoon!" We had spent that entire afternoon in search of this raccoon, the community's most wanted villain. For several weeks, the Lost and Found column of the Post Oak Gazette had been peppered with lost cat entries. I remember being shown a highlighted column with more than a few addresses on streets I traveled regularly. The word amongst the well-informed of the neighborhood, such as my older sister, and indeed Brian himself, my very own preteen best friend, was that a satanic cult, most likely the one which performed rituals in the woods behind the 7-Eleven, was behind the cat disappearances, and that they were obviously being used as pet sacrifices as part of a pre-Halloween series of rituals. And furthermore, it was somehow known to the juvenile citizens of my block that the ultimate sacrifice was to be made on Halloween night. A human being. In hindsight, I can imagine that the journalistic freedoms afforded to a small community paper, such as the Post Oak Gazette, might include a divertive article on the dangers that rabid raccoons pose to family pets, such as cats, as a means to address or even subvert a groundswell of misguided hysteria aimed at a non-existent satanic cult. Indeed, the most recent Monday edition of the small paper did just that, and went a step further, as it identified the culprit of any missing cats in the area to be, quote, most likely a rabid raccoon. Hence, the great rabid raccoon hunt of Halloween 1988 began in earnest. You see, it was not lost on us kids, not even for a second, that the only thing worse than an unvalidated satanic cult operating behind our Slurpee stop was the validated threat of a rabies-scared parent on Halloween. Candy rules much of a kid's life, in thought and action. And this kind of threat to our only comes once a year trick-or-treat session just wouldn't stand. Not for 1 second. Halloween was the following Monday. We had 1 week to catch and or kill that sick raccoon. Looking back, it's impressive to note the coordination we achieved in the pre-internet era. As word of the rabid raccoon spread throughout the community, and as more and more kids were coming home from a hard afternoon's play to dinner table conversations with unthinkable statements like, well, we may have to skip trick-or-treat this year if they can't catch these rabid raccoons. More and more kids in our community began to talk to each other about what to do about this threat to Halloween night. We began meeting after school on the Faye's hillside lawn. Most came intuitively armed with a broom handle, some of them impressively sharpened. Some arrived with nunchucks. Uwe had stolen his brother's throwing stars and told us that he also had a German Luger pistol in his backpack. We all knew he was lying. By the end of that first week following the infamous rabid raccoon column, there were kids from as far away as Cabin John Park showing up to our hillside yard meetings. That's about 2 miles as a car drives, but in kid miles, it's somewhere between 38 and 40. It was apparent that our block was the epicenter of the cat disappearances, and what made that especially clear was one missing cat in particular. Its name was Snips, and it was the only cat to have a reward of $100 no less offered for its safe return. Now Snips was an infamous cat with an infamous owner. Just around the corner from the Fay house, there lived a very strange man who, had it not been for the disappearance of his own cat, would have likely been at the top of any kid's list of possible pet sacrificer suspects. He was a shut-in, and he was known by all as the grumpy old man who walked his cat on a leash. His name was Mr. Jurgensen, and most only knew his name because that's how he identified himself in his missing cat ad. But I had known it. And I had more reason to dislike Mr. Jurgensen than any other kid in the neighborhood. On Christmas Day 1985, I was given the best gift a 6-year-old can receive. A dog. A puppy that would grow into a beautiful, strong collie. Her name was Molly, and by her second Christmas, she was pulling me across the snow-covered streets of Devilwood Drive as I sat proudly atop my new steel-railed sled, feet pushing against the wooden steering beam, her leash in my hand. She ran so fast in her harness, with such strength. It was as if she were a dog 3 times her size. I remember shouting and laughing as I looked to my left, seeing the cold stare of Mr. Jurgensen as he awkwardly walked his tall, thin, strangely thin-haired cat. They seemed to tiptoe, each with a similarly shaped stick inserted firmly and exactly where you might imagine. Eyes snarling at me and my beast, making too much noise, having too much fun. It was a short time later, after spring had sprung and my dad had decided that it was time for Molly to transition to an outside dog, that the first letter arrived in our mailbox. True, it was with a considerable and consistent amount of protest that Molly began to spend her time in our backyard instead of in our living room. She barked and barked and barked. And Mr. Jurgensen and his cat were, quote, wholly disturbed. It didn't take long for the letters requesting our dog be silenced to take on a threatening tone. And according to my mom, the last protest letter included insinuations of dog poisoning. So, one day I came home from school, and Molly the collie, a boy's best friend, was gone. Gone to a lovely farm with lots of room to run, I was told. I would never have wished harm to anyone's cat, but if I had been pressed at knife point to choose a sacrifice for the 7-Eleven Satanist's ultimate evil deed, I might have insinuated Mr. Jurgensen was a good candidate. So it was a strange sort of sympathy that I observed in myself when I read of his missing cat. Mr. Jurgensen, who hated dogs and children. Mr. Jurgensen, who walked his cat in the snow. He was in pain. He was suffering a similar loss to the one he had caused me to endure, and I wasn't happy at all about it. I guess, in a simple ad, I read and felt that, in his way, he must have loved too. Whether it was the shot-in-the-dark possibility of finding Snips alive and claiming that $100 reward, that's very close to Nintendo Action Set money in 1988, or the shock of learning that Mr. Jurgensen had both a heart and humility enough to ask his community for help, or some combination of the two. By day 3, the official name and battle cry of the Devilwood Drive hunting party became Snips's Avengers. I can remember having a hard time saying Snips's. We spent that entire week searching for raccoons and calling for Snips, and by Friday, we were losing hope. The good news was that not a single kid had been attacked by a rabid raccoon. That might go far enough for some freewheeling parents, but our crew took no such hope to heart. Our parents all knew far too well that raccoons were nocturnal. We had each at some point already had the fight with our folks about putting the trash out early Saturday morning as opposed to Friday night before bed. Yes, it was clear. We needed a body. A dead body. A dead raccoon body. Then, Saturday morning, just as the garbage trucks began their clanky march down the drive, kids were waking up to the downturned noses of dads at the breakfast table, reading aloud to their wives that, "Oh, looks like a pest control guy captured and euthanized a rabid raccoon last night on Kensington Avenue." All across my neighborhood that morning, the sighs of relief were heaved with gusto. The children of the Post Oak Gazette's readership sat down to their Saturday morning cartoons without the shadow of a ruined trick-or-treat. And that was almost more than they had hoped for. That Saturday unwound in a typical procession of events. Chores first, then bikes, skateboards, community center ping pong, more bikes. My first listen to Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. A rare parking lot demonstration of a high schooler with a mustache pulling a multi-second endo on his GT Pro Performer. That's a freestyle BMX bike. Then back home and up late with a VHS from Errol's Video. Anything Van Damme. Then Sunday was church, and that was basically an all-day affair in my family. Over and done. Monday, October 31st, 1988 felt good from the start.
Good morning, all you ghouls and goblins. Yeah, it's Halloween, baby. As you head out to school or work this morning, do be careful on the roads. After a long dry spell, the rain has left a little pooling out there. The rain is forecasted to taper off as the evening progresses, but early trick-or-treaters might encounter a shower or two. So Mom, Dad, grab those umbrellas, but get the kids out there and get them some candy. Yeah! Stay tuned after the commercial break. I'll be back to get your morning started off right with a classic Halloween ghost story. This is Ricky Venezuela from WQRX. Yeah, baby!
For many small businesses, telephone communication is still a kind of groping in the dark.
Hello?
Hello?
Who's this?
Who's there?
But now you can overcome all that with the Moon System from AT&T.
High on a hilltop near your home, there stands a dilapidated old mansion. Some say the place is haunted, but you don't believe in such myths. One dark and stormy night, a light appears in the topmost window in the tower.
Bye, Mom.
Did you eat your breakfast?
Yeah.
Stepping out onto the street that morning, it was impossible not to notice how perfect the conditions were for the day. There was the appropriate crispness of air on the walk to school that morning. The sound of wind whipping up dry leaves. Mrs. Barrowman bent over atop a lawn bag, shuffling handfuls of tangible fall between her legs. Yes, it was a school day, but not even the academic demands of the 4th grade could overshadow the jubilance of Halloween for a kid. The teachers knew this and didn't even try to preoccupy us with actual work. I remember costumes and, yes, candy. There was Wadsworth Longfellow for our English module. Each heart has its haunted chamber, where the silent moonlight falls. On the floor are mysterious footsteps. There are whispers along the walls. There were spooky songs in music class.
Have you seen a ghost of Joan? Long white bones with the skin all gone. Ooh, wouldn't it be chilly with no skin on?
I think we multiplied Smarties for math. And then a parade, and lunch, and recess, and some bathroom trips, and then home for trick-or-treating. I remember walking home, intentionally taking the wooded path behind the sports fields, alone and fully embracing the spookiness of the day's mood, because it was wrapped in so much fun. Isn't that what Halloween is? Horror wrapped in fun. Death served with sweets. My memories of the afternoon are blurred. There was my arrival home from school. Normally, I would throw the backpack down, talk dinner and homework with Mom, and hit the streets. But on Halloween night, there's preparation and waiting. Because Halloween is the one school night that didn't start until after the streetlights came on. That's right. In the 80s, we did our trick-or-treating in the dark. I remember standing in the bathroom mirror, getting my G.I. Joe costume together. I was always a G.I. Joe. It was easy, and Chuckles, the Hawaiian shirt, army green pant wearing character, really resonated with me. I guess he still does because that's actually most of what's in my closet today. Standing there, drawing a fake scar on my cheek, I heard my mom talking to another woman. The tone was frantic, and the voice was clearly that of Mrs. Fay. Her Scottish brogue was thick and tearful. I heard them approaching, and as I stepped out into the hallway, I was struck by her countenance. Obvious tears welling up in her eyes, she asked me, with her head turned to the side, "Tanner, my dear, have you seen Kevin?" It was strange. As she spoke, my heart was climbing into my throat as I expected her to tell me something bad had happened to Brian. Had I seen Kevin? 16-year-old, tough, foul-mouthed, black-fingernailed punk rocker Kevin. Big brother Kevin. Had I seen him? "No," I said. "I haven't seen him." "He's been gone since Sunday morning," she told me with a broken calmness. "We can't find him." By we, I suddenly knew she meant her and Owen and Mr. Fay and Brian. Suddenly, I noticed that I hadn't seen Brian on the walk to school that morning. He was always in the vicinity, on his way or just past the elementary, en route to junior high. He often walked with me. We would certainly have talked about our costumes and the trick-or-treating to come, and we'd have joked about toilet papering someone's house. But he wasn't there this morning. Mrs. Fay told me that Brian had spent the previous night out with his brother and parents searching for Kevin. He was, in fact, out searching now. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Fay. I'll look for him tonight." "Thank you, dear," she said. My mother offered her condolences, walking her out and across the street. Well, to say this put a damper on my evening is probably just about the right language. At 9 years old, I couldn't really fathom the sorts of trouble a 16-year-old punk rocker could find himself in, barring some sort of satanic ritual, that is. But that sort of thing, it's not actually real, right? Evening came, and I, Chuckles, along with a horde of Care Bears and Gremlins, Jasons and Freddy Kruegers, and various iterations of Arnold Schwarzeneggers, began our door-to-door march. Trick-or-treat! It wasn't long before I began to see the flyers Mrs. Fay had made taped to all the doors of the houses with their lights off. The universal, "we don't participate" signal, right? Presumably, she was going door to door with the groups of children, passing out flyers to everyone else. On the flyer was a recent picture of Kevin and a description of what clothing he was last known to have worn, with the words, "Please call if you have any information on his whereabouts," preceded by the Fay family home phone number. As I worked my way down Devilwood Drive, pillowcase growing fuller with each stop, I felt Brian's absence in a way that was more worry than sadness. I certainly worried for some unknown bad thing that had befallen his brother Kevin, but equally, I worried how that might impact my friendship with Brian. If Kevin had run away and was never found, would the Fays move away? Back to Scotland? Or would they stay and never be the same? Would my friend stop coming out to play? Without really understanding its profundity, I worried about the hole that a missing kid can cause in a community of two. It was without notice of forethought that I found myself walking up to Mr. Jurgensen's front door. Looking up and seeing his porch light on, somehow I mustered the strength to continue. Up the 3 steps of the stoop, hand outstretched to take hold of the weathered brass knocker. But before my hand landed, the door opened, and a warm, sickly sweet smell wafted down from the ceiling of his tiny foyer and enveloped my head, filling my nostrils as I gasped in surprise. I don't know why, but out of my mouth came the words,
Have you seen Kevin?
Immediately, I began to try and restate my intentions.
I mean, I'm trick-or-treating, but this kid, he's missing.
I'm sorry.
I turned to walk away and felt a hand on my shoulder. Stopping, I looked over at Mr. Jurgensen, and in his eyes I saw something that surprised me. Concern. Turning back to face him, I saw that he had one of Mrs. Fay's flyers still in his hand. His porch light must only have been on because she'd just attached it to his door, and he'd just gone out to retrieve it. Looking down at the flyer in his own hand, he said,
Yes, I know.
and then he said,
Please, come in. I'd like to ask you some questions about him. The missing boy.
Kevin.
I stated.
Yes, Kevin.
He answered. There's a strange thing that happens to me. I don't know what else to compare it to but hypnosis. And maybe also that state you can induce in sharks and certain lizards by rubbing their bellies. There have been times in my life when the right person at the right time has made the obviously wrong suggestion to me, and yet I have found myself powerless to deny it. My first memory of this was when I was 6 years old, just barely swimming at a survivable level. I stood on the end of a Bethany Beach House dock while my much older brother approached in a canoe full of hard-won crabs. I was eager to see all that he had caught in his traps, and so I stood there waiting excitedly for him. As he neared, paddling his canoe from side to side until turning, aligning the boat's port side to drift gently into the dock, my older sister stood behind me and began softly chanting,
Jump. Jump. Jump.
I can't explain it. Through glazed over eyes I can still see my brother's face, realizing what was happening. I guess by my sister's smile, and by my posture perhaps. He dropped the oar and frantically started waving his arms and shouting, No! But I did jump. As if I were a thrown rock, I jumped. My feet landed on the sidewall of the canoe as if directed by complex guided systems. The canoe, spinning on its horizontal axis like one of those desktop gadgets from Sharper Image. I seemed to watch from above as I, my brother, and a half bushel of crabs went sliding into the water. I will never forget the combined sounds of my brother's screaming in anger and my sister's uproarious laughter. Another time, just a year prior to standing on Mr. Jurgensen's doorstep, I sat in a long school hallway outside of my dad's office, and the suggestion came into my mind from I really don't know where, but the effect on me was the same. Pull the fire alarm, it said. Unbelievably, I obeyed, and you can imagine the scene that ensued. And now again, here I stood, so much more than suggestible. I was entranced. Mr. Jurgensen led me beyond his foyer and through a dark and newspaper-littered dining room to a small table in his kitchen.
Sit down,
He said, pulling a wobbly wooden chair out with one hand and clearing the table of more newspapers with the other. I sat.
Mr. Jurgensen?
I said, my eyes clearing suddenly from the haze of the trance.
Why am I here?
Tell me, do you think my house smells funny?
He answered.
Well, I don't know. Why? I don't have cats, so I don't...
I don't have a cat either!
He shouted.
Anymore, that is.
He continued, more composed now, but I was far too startled to remain. Having stood and already taken a step backwards, towards the dining room, and the foyer, and the front door, and my escape, he then said in a sing-songy voice,
I do know where he is.
but I was never going to find out what he intended to mean by that. Racing to the door, I shouted not words back at Mr. Jurgensen, but a primal scream, as if I were trying to both frighten him and convince myself that I was not frightened. I don't think I accomplished either, but I truly believe I ran as fast as I have ever run, and I got to be very fast in high school. I ran and I got out of that front door and around the street corner before Mr. Jurgensen had time to push his chair in. I ran and was home. My mom was waiting for me on the front porch, talking to a neighbor as I rushed up to meet her. Falling into her arms, I muttered,
Mr. Jurgensen.
The rest of the night was spent explaining all that had happened in those few moments. Every detail I could recall. The smell, the newspapers, his demeanor.
He was scary, Mom. Not scary like we thought. Like, really scary.
That's what I remember telling her. The next morning, I walked to school, again without Brian. It would be another week before I saw him again for the last time. Meanwhile, Kevin never turned up, and the Fays understood somehow that he wouldn't be coming home. Ever. The third week of November, our school held an assembly, and some local policemen, and I think some kind of federal agent trained in child safety, gave a long and detailed presentation about kidnapping and stranger danger and child danger avoidance in general. They made reference to a crime that had been committed in our community, a missing teen, and a bad man. Some years later, I learned that as a result of a tip from my mom and following an awkward police visit, detectives had obtained a warrant to search Mr. Jurgensen's house and found it vacant. Reports detailed a smell and a cadaver dog was brought in. The report stated that the dog signaled to its handler in such a way that it was presumed possible that a body had been in the basement and been recently removed. As far as I know, Mr. Jurgensen was not ever apprehended for further questioning. Both the Fay house and the Jurgensen house sat empty for what seemed like the rest of my childhood. But then, we moved when I was 10. For as long as I live, I will remember the way I felt about the Fay brothers. I will remember the way they made me feel. The fine line of horror and excitement which they seemed to live to dance upon. The fear they helped me to contemplate, and the strength of their desire to wield it a sword. And, for as long as I live, I will remember the way Mr. Jurgensen made me feel. That rare gift he gave me. A once-in-a-lifetime chance to stare real evil in the face. Old and decrepit as it was, real evil sought to suggest something to me that night. Something of hatred and hidden layers of inescapable dissent, and stolen life, and I believe my own death. And I said no. Strangely or not, I also remembered the words from the missing cat ad that started it all.
Snips, missing, October 20th, 1988. Please help. $100 reward if returned safely to owner. Signed, Mr. L. D. Jurgensen.
I guess if there's one thing I learned that Halloween, one takeaway that is both horrifying and at the same time somehow comforting, it's that everyone suffers from the pain of loss. Even the evil.
Smiling at trouble, for trouble's a bubble, and bubbles will soon go away. With never a sadness, and nothing but gladness, we'd weary of life in a day. Be like the violets that doze neath the chill winter snows, they bravely wait for the May. So keep smiling at trouble, for trouble's a bubble, and bubbles will soon go away.
You are a bold and courageous person,